All right, so you just read a little bit about Rene Descartes, but they didn't really tell the story the way I like to tell the story. And so I'm going to tell you a story that involves Rene Descartes, also Luigi Galvani, and actually also, now that I think of it, Paul Broca. But it's a bigger story I want to tell, and I want to start here. When I did this in class back in the days when I lectured, I would always play a song at the beginning of class, something that related to the lecture. For one of my lectures, the one most related to this one, I always had the Police playing, and they have this song that goes, "We are spirits in a material world." Same idea captured by this sign. We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. Are we? Is that true? This question really explains partly why it took us so long to experimentally study ourselves, to scientifically study ourselves. Because quite honestly, for much of human existence, we have thought of ourselves as spirits in a material world. That there's part of us, if not all of us, that's more like a spiritual being, like an angel, put on this earth, surrounded by material beings like animals and plants and those sorts of things. But we were special, we were different. And if you believe this, if we are spirit, what's really the difference between a spiritual thing and a non-spiritual thing? Well, what scientists largely believe is that non-spiritual things must behave according to laws of science. Whether it be how they fall from a building, whether it's how much force it takes to move them, whether it's the rate of growth as a function of how much water and sun they're given, etc. That there are rules that govern what material things can do, and science is about figuring out those rules, using the scientific method to try to understand how those things work. What are the laws that govern the behavior? Now, if we are spirits, if we are non-material, well, what makes something spiritual? It doesn't conform to physical laws, right? Like a ghost can walk through walls, or speak to us from beyond the grave, etc. Those are things that are supernatural. They are not bound by laws. And if we are like that, then it doesn't make sense to scientifically study us. But in the early days, before psychology was born, and you'll see we'll be going back to Rene Descartes here, some of the ideas that started with Descartes started to question this and started to suggest, well, maybe we're not totally spirits. Maybe we're not spirits at all. Maybe we are material beings in a material world. Even if you don't go all the way to material beings in a material world, if you agree we are partly material, then at least that part can be studied scientifically. So that's the story. So let's go through the story a little bit. Now, Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes, I'll just give you the things we all know. He wanted to try to get at the truth of things. And so to get at the truth, he said, well, I'm going to start with a fact. I'm going to try to find a fact that just cannot be denied. We're living in the post-truth world. This is kind of an interesting process nowadays. But I'm going to try to something that I just cannot doubt. And then I'll start from there, and I'll use other chains of reasoning to figure out other truths that come from that first truth. And what is that first truth? This is his famous cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He said the most primitive truth I can find is the truth of my own existence. And the fact that I am thinking about my existence and mulling all over this says that I do exist, and that must be true. And so this was the original truth he could not deny. And then he would try to figure out other truths from that. Now, Rene Descartes was a philosopher. He was many things: a philosopher, a mathematician, just one of these guys we call polymaths because he had so much influence in so many different areas, including psychology, as you'll see. He was also kind of a troubled guy. He believed, by the way, in innate knowledge. This is something we're going to kind of flirt with all through psychology and this chapter. So, how much of what we know are we born with? whether that's genetic or just innate, something we all have, and how much do we learn? So we're going to call this the nature-nurture controversy. He thought we had available to us a bunch of innate knowledge. We just had to figure out how to get to it. And this is his process for doing it. So he's certainly weighing in on this nature-nurture debate as well with his ideas. These are the standard things about René Descartes. I want to tell you about some other things. And so this one goes back to Aristotle. René has really affected the way all of us, and scientists especially, think about the relationship between humans and animals, and between humans, animals, and the notion of a soul or some spiritual notion. In the early days of science, they would use words like soul and mind interchangeably because it seemed to be that part of us we didn't understand that was alive within us. So they would talk about a lot of things as having a soul, and Aristotle, in fact, made this distinction. He said, plants have a vegetative soul. Their focus is simply on growth and getting bigger and all of that stuff, so reproducing and growing. He thought animals had those instincts too, but they had other ones. They had what he called a sensitive soul. They could move around the environment and run into other things, etc. So they also had to sense the environment. So they could sense the input from the environment, and they could move around within it. And he called this a sensitive soul. He thought it was a higher level of soul than what plants had. And then, of course, humans, he thought, in fact, had another level. They had everything else previous ones have, reproduction, growth, mobility, sensation, but they also had this unique ability, Aristotle thought, to think and reflect on their own existence. And he called that the rational soul. And so René Descartes was very interested in this. Now, René, for his part, put a lot of emphasis originally on mobility. He thought, you know what, plants don't really have a soul, not the way we really think of a soul, but things that move, and especially if they move with seeming intention, he thought those things had a soul until something interesting happened. So here's the story. Like many geniuses, René had issues. He had difficulties just with life, with the process of being alive. And he would have nervous breakdowns, what they called them at the time, where he just, had too much. And one of these times, his doctor told him, you know what, you need to go and relax a little bit, René. So go to France, enjoy the gardens. And so René thought that sounded like a good idea. When he went there, he went to the Palace of Versailles. And he went there on purpose because they had a new thing in their garden, something nobody had seen. So, of course, in France, the gardens have beautiful statues and beautiful plants and greens, nice areas to walk around, gardens, etc. But this one had something else, and René had to see it. And so here's what happened. He was walking through this garden, and up ahead of him, he saw a statue of the Princess Diana. Beautiful. And he really wanted to see this statue closer. As he walked down the pathway towards the statue, something really interesting happened. Another statue of Neptune, god of water, the sea, with a trident, came out from behind a bush and blocked his path to see Diana. A statue came from behind a bush and blocked his path with seeming intention. This freaked René out. It would probably freak you out too if you never saw a statue move before. Now, first of all, how did this happen? Well, it was the time when they were just discovering hydraulics. And so what literally happened is René was walking down that path. He stepped on a pressure plate. His weight pushed down that plate, which pushed water through a tube, which was a strong enough force to push that statue, which was probably on rails, relatively low friction, push that statue out from behind the bush in front of the path. It's a special effect, right? All hooked up to work this way. René knew it was a special effect. That didn't make it any more impressive or any less impressive for him. He thought, that statue is not alive. It does not have a soul. It's rock. But it moved with seeming intention. It looked like it was trying to block my path. And so what this means is just because something moves with seeming intention that does not mean it has a soul. That statue does not have a soul, but it was able to look intentional. So Rene thought about this and he thought, you know what? Animals, I think they're like that statue. I think they're just complex biological machines that do not have a soul. They just look like they're moving with intention, but they're not. They're just responding to their environment. They're machines. They're complicated machines. What about humans? Well, he didn't go that far with humans. This is what he thought of as humans, and this is now known as Cartesian Dualism. So he thought humans are made up of two separate things, sort of. There is their body. And their body, he thought, was a complex biological machine. It is just like an animal. But in addition, what a human has that animals don't have is a mind or a soul, as it were. And the textbook talks about this a little bit, that he actually specified where he thought the soul connected with the body. But he thought we had two aspects. Now, we could respond as a machine, so that's the sort of reflexive behaviors, or we could respond with intention from our soul. We had the ability to take control of the machine. Now, this was very important at the time, of course, because without control, you lose responsibility. And if you argue that humans are just machines and they're just responding to their environment, then you can't really blame them if they do bad things, right? But if you say, no, you are in charge of your machine, now if you do something bad, you're responsible. And so for purposes of the church and legal systems and everything, I think it made a lot of sense to him not to just talk about humans as fully machines. But he talked about them as partly machines. You know, there was this aspect where he thought a lot of us as basic machinery that a soul is able to control and interact with. Even if we're part machine, that part we can study scientifically. That part we can apply the scientific method to and understand better. So he kind of opened the door, you know, from just talking about these things as though they were spiritual entities in a material world. He's saying, no, humans are part material, part spiritual. And that opened the door a crack for the scientific-minded people to say, well, I want to study that material part of human behavior. Now, there's something else really interesting that came from this. And, you know, I almost hesitate to show you this next slide. So let me just say, if you are very animal sensitive, as I am, you may not want to look at the slide that I'm about to show you. I will describe it. I will give you described video. You can put your hand over the slide itself, but I'm gonna do it next anyway here. Ready? Okay. As a result of Descartes' ideas, specifically him suggesting that animals were just machines, there was a lot of interest at this time in understanding that biological machinery. And so if you wanted to understand it, well, how do you understand a machine? Well, you watch it working, right? And so this brought up the practice that we now call vivisection, a practice that continues today. Vivisection, what does that mean? Vivi means alive, section means to open, to cut in pieces, to cut animals in pieces while they're alive. Why? While they're alive. So literally, you know, what they would do, and again, I apologize, this hurts me as much as it hurts some of you, they would take living animals, they would sometimes tie them or nail them to a board, and they would perform surgery on them while they were still alive, because they wanted to see the heart beating, they wanted to see the lungs doing their thing, they wanted to understand how the machine worked. How could they ever do this? Couldn't, you know, isn't this horrific? Don't they know this is just a terrible thing to do? Well, Rene actually said, no, it's not a terrible thing to do at all. And let me give you an analogy. This isn't an analogy Rene had at his fingertips, but it's one we can think about today that makes his story make a little bit more sense. So imagine you're on the side of the 401 and you see this car coming really, really fast. And when you look to your left, you know the traffic is blocked there. But you also know this person that's coming fast can't see that and isn't going to be able to see that till maybe they come over a little hill or something like that. And so you're worried about what's going to happen. And you're watching this car come fast. It comes over the hill and suddenly the driver can see what's coming. So he slams on the brakes. What happens when he slams on the brakes? This car is now screeching. Tires are screeching. It's shimmying in weird ways. It's maybe even might roll over if he loses traction. Maybe it rolls and makes crashes, screaming, terrible sort of sounds. Is that car in pain? The driver might be in pain. The human inside the car might be in pain. But is the car in pain? It looks like it's in pain. It's shuddering and doing a bunch of crazy things. It sounds like it's in pain. It's screaming out in a sense. But it's a machine, right? It's not in pain. It doesn't feel the pain. This is what Rene said to scientists. This is exactly what's going on. He didn't use the car analogy. He didn't have the car analogy. But that was the story he told. They are machines. What you are seeing is a natural reaction to what you are doing to the machine. But it is not real pain. The animal is not really experiencing this. And so, in fact, he would say things like, if it really bothers you, one of the first things you should do is cut their vocal cords. Then they can't scream. Yeah. What do you think? A lot of research continues. We certainly continue with animal research, and we continue to do things to animals that we would consider unethical if it was done to humans. Is this okay? Do you agree with Descartes? And if not, should we be doing the things that we're doing? You know, I actually am a voice on this campus that will say, no, we shouldn't. I don't believe we have the right to do things to animals that are considered unethical if we did them to other humans. And I say that whenever I can. I am the outlier. Most of your professors will believe this is perfectly normal and acceptable behavior. I want to prompt you to think about it. What do you think? I'm going to leave it there with you. But let's take another step. So we have Rene Descartes just saying, he's a philosopher, right? Philosophers just throw out ideas. So his idea is humans are part machine, part soul, and animals are totally machine. Let's do the animals are totally machine. It's fine to say that. Luigi Galvani was a biologist, and he was working at a time when scientists were just hobbyists. You know, they had labs in their basement. Darwin was out in his garden all the time doing stuff. That's, you know, that was his lab, so to speak. Luigi Galvani had a little lab in the basement, and he was doing some research. And every now and then, these scientists would get together at a big conference they would have, the Academy of the Sciences, and they would show off to each other. They would show their coolest experiments. And so one day, Luigi Galvani came in, and he went in front of everybody, and great to be here with you all today. I have a very interesting experiment to show you all. This is supposed to be me being Italian. I'm not very good at Italian. My apologies to all you Italian people in the audience. I want you to see this frog leg. You will notice there is no frog attached. There is just the frog legs. Actually, this has a bit of frog attached, but sometimes he would just use the leg, and he would actually hold it up, and he would show people the following. Here's this leg, this frog leg, and I have this ability to put an electrical current through it. And he did it through static electricity. He actually created the battery after a while, but that's another story. But with static electricity, he would show that if you could touch a certain muscle and put electricity to it, the leg would do this. And if you undid it, sorry, how do I do this for you? So if you give it the stimulation, it would do that. You undo it, it kicks out. What we have here is a dancing frog leg. A frog leg that dances simply as a function of electricity being added to a muscle. He literally was showing that the body of this frog, nobody believed there was a soul anymore. There's just legs here. There's muscle tissue, and there's, basically bodily tissue. And he was showing that with that bodily tissue, if you touch it with an electrical current, the muscle contracts, which was essentially showing it was acting like a machine. The body was kind of machine-like, responding to electricity. This, by the way, is about the same time the Frankenstein novel was written. People were really interested in the machinery of the body and electricity, which brought Frankenstein to life, right, as the motivator, as the thing that made the body move. And that was largely because of results like Luigi Galvani. And so, by the end of this, when we're coming to the end of the 1700s into the 1800s, we have philosophers who are talking about humans as being at least partly material beings. if not totally. Some philosophers were going further than Rene Descartes, Locke and others, and they were saying, hey, we're totally material. But we also had biologists conducting experiments on animals that seemed to support that. It showed the sort of machinery of animals. And so, again, more and more, it started to look like, okay, all right, we can scientifically study, well, animals anyway, and try to understand them, but humans too. So one more story for you to think about. Remember, Rene said, oh yeah, animals are machines, but humans have a soul. How machine-like are humans? And, is it just our muscles, or does it go right down to the most sort of intimate parts of ourselves, our brains? Well, here's an interesting kind of thing from psychology. Dr. Paul Broca. Dr. Broca was, again, in the 1800s, early 1800s. He was going from hospital to hospital, and he just happened to notice a cluster of patients who had the same kind of odd symptomology. Their symptomology was this: they could understand language fine. If you asked them, go over there and get that pen and pick it up and hand it to me, they would go get the pen, pick it up, and hand it to you. Whatever instructions you gave them, they could follow, so they can understand you well. When they spoke to you, though, they couldn't speak well. The words were right. Sometimes it was sort of fluent, but it made no sense. The things they said made no sense. We now call this Broca's aphasia, by the way. They can't produce meaningful speech. So they can understand speech, but they couldn't produce it. Paul thought, this is odd, very strange. I'd like to know more about this. And specifically, he made the following odd request of his patients. He said, listen, I've got a really uncomfortable question to ask you, but I have to ask it. I kind of think your issue might have something to do with part of your brain being damaged. And so I would like to look directly at your brain. Now, obviously, that's not an easy thing to do. So what I'm asking you is the following. When you die, will you give me permission at that time to crack open your skull and look at your brain? He found a bunch of people that said, sure. And then he waited. Very patient man. He waited. Eventually they died. Eventually he cracked open their skull. And what he found is that every one of them had damage right to this part of their brain, a part we now call Broca's area. Wernicke's area, by the way, is important to comprehending a language. If you have damage here, you can get the reverse aphasia, where you can't understand language, but you can produce it. That's called Wernicke's aphasia. But Broca's is when you can't produce language. And he found that this area of the brain was critical for it. So it suggested, again, it's almost like the brain of the human brain is machine-like, where parts of it are doing very specific things. And so it was in the context of this that psychology was born, where people are saying, you know what, it looks like we are kind of machine-like, material-like, and we can use the scientific process to study ourselves as well. So these were all really critical things happening before the actual birth of psychology that kind of made it all sensical. Okay, see you in the next video.